So let's just take a short moment to remember our motivation, right? So you don't need to go through all the stages, but just renew this determination or aspiration, at least, to continue to study this text, not just for our own benefit, but for the benefit of all sentient beings. Okay, great. So we're ready to continue. Today there are no prayers yet, because anyway, if we do them in the morning. But before I forget, I want to say something about this now. It's pretty simple, and you're familiar with this prayer. We'll do the prayer of refuge and bodhicitta tomorrow, and what are called the 4 immeasurables. Not much. It's only those 2. There's no need to recite that many prayers. But I want to say just 2 or 3 words about refuge. So, of course, many of you are already taking what's called taking refuge. But I think it's important for those who are not familiar with it, just to say 2 or 3 words about it, that taking refuge is sometimes misunderstood, as in like, I'll give up my freedom, I now take refuge, I have to rely on someone and so forth. It's just the term itself. It literally means in Tibetan, for instance, to go for protection or to go for refuge. Now, what it means is, when we have a problem, we always go for refuge. And if it's a bar of chocolate, right? If we're miserable, I want to get rid of that. I need some chocolate, right? Or I'm so distracted, I can't stop thinking about this, and it's really a problem. I need to watch a movie or call a friend, right? So here, taking refuge doesn't mean we need to stop that. But it means that we mentally entrust ourselves into the means and methods of how to deal with the problem as set forth by the Buddha. So it's not about the Buddha wanting us to hear saying that because it makes him feel better or whatever. Like, I take refuge in the Buddha, in the Dharma, in the Sangha. That is usually what you recite. It's not about that. It's just about reminding ourselves, besides the cake and besides the chocolate, well, to check, maybe I find a solution to this problem in the teachings of the Buddha. Maybe just familiarizing myself with the teaching on impermanence. Things change all the time. On the fact that, well, all our experiences are actually in the nature of suffering, so let's be realistic about the happy experiences we have. They change. They won't be the same all the time. Let's enjoy them from what they are and not have false expectations. So these kind of ideas, to reflect on them, especially when we're not feeling well, but of course also when we're doing well, to remind ourselves. And so the 3 objects of refuge are Buddha, Dharma, Sangha. So it's mainly Dharma. We take refuge in the teachings of the Buddha, in the widest sense, and that's enough for now to talk about Dharma as referring to the teachings the Buddha gave. So to basically say, okay, there are these ideas, these means and methods, and I'm entrusting myself to them. That is, I remember when it's necessary, or even better, at all times, impermanence, the suffering nature of our existence, that there's a way out, emptiness, and so forth, right? And the Buddha, being the one who taught this, so being the person who taught the Dharma, and indirectly, therefore, I take refuge in that person, but I also take refuge in what is called the Sangha, or the spiritual community. Those who, like myself, follow this path. And so maybe I to say it in modern terms, call someone up and say, what do you think? How can I deal with this situation, and so forth? Or just see others as an example that you can learn from, for example. And the thing with the Buddha, of course the Buddha is no longer around, but the Buddha is still around in the form of the great lamas we still have, right? We have these amazing masters. And we may feel connected to some and less connected to others. That's very natural. But with regard to these lamas, I mean, they represent, they may not be Buddhas. They may be, they may not be. Who knows? I mean, taking, for instance, His Holiness the Dalai Lama. I think if anyone is enlightened nowadays, then it's His Holiness, but we don't know, right? His Holiness's knowledge, His Holiness's insights are so beyond ours that it's very difficult to determine on what level His Holiness is, but for sure he's a Bodhisattva, if not a fully enlightened Buddha. And so taking refuge in him doesn't mean we need to see him all the time. The connection you make with the Lama is mental, right? It's totally mental. It's not a physical, in the sense that you need to see them all the time and talk to them all the time. And it's nice, of course, to see His Holiness in the temple when there are teachings and so forth. But even that is not necessary. You know, in Tibet, before the Tibetans left their country, I mean, some practitioners, they had this Lama, this root Lama as it's called, the main Lama, and they never met him. Right? They heard his teachings maybe in the form of writing, or they very rarely met their Lama. I mean, you know, ride on the back of a yak for like days to get there and then return. It's not a journey you do every day. So oftentimes their Lamas were far away, and if their Lama was the Dalai Lama, I mean the previous reincarnations, the previous incarnations of the Dalai Lamas, well, the whole journey to Lhasa was long. And so they understood it's a mental connection. And the connection comes from practicing what they teach. Right? And it's very straightforward. His Holiness is very straightforward about what he teaches. Bodhicitta and emptiness. He stresses those two. Okay? But it's kind of an object of refuge. It's this connection you have with this person. There's a sense of protection. And since it's mental, it doesn't matter where you are. It's just as long as you think of the Lama in the form of His Holiness, or seeing him as inseparable with the Buddha, you get the full benefit of relying on the Buddha and the Dalai Lama and His Holiness as an example. But you may have another Lama who you feel close to. But here it's not an ordinary person. That's really, those are masters. Those are special beings. And when you're around a little bit, you very easily find out who are what are called the Lamas. Right, okay, so this much on that. So just for tomorrow, when we take refuge, it's not about giving up your independence. It's not about, I don't know, not being able to think for yourself any longer. No, but have that protection. It's like going to a doctor, getting medicine, and having some nurses to assist you in the treatment. That's the example that's given by someone called Maitreya in a wonderful text called Uttara Tantra. So he describes Buddha, Dharma, Sangha like relying on the doctor. And let's face it, we still need to take the medicine ourselves and, I don't know, restrict our diet and so forth. So the doctor can only do that much, but can tell us what to do and show us how to get better. And that's how the example is usually used. Okay, great. That's for tomorrow morning though. Okay. Now let's go back to the text. So what we've had so far, what we've studied so far, is, well, we've heard that this particular text is part of this genre of teaching called the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras. And we've also heard that the Buddha taught his entire life, not his entire life, from his enlightenment until his death. He gave teachings, because the Buddha cannot transfer his realizations of reality onto us. So the way to convey reality to us was through his teachings. But actually, one thing that's quite interesting, There is a quote that's quite popular or quite famous in a sutra that's called the Lalita Vistara Sutra. I'm probably saying it incorrectly. Lalita Vistara. Comes close to the Sanskrit. How would you pronounce it?
Lalita Vistara Sutra.
Lalita Vistara Sutra. Okay, so that sounds much better. Much more like Sanskrit. The thing is, in this sutra, well, this one quote, and His Holiness quotes this a lot. The words are profound and pacified, free from fabrications, uncompounded luminosity. Okay? Profound and pacified, free from fabrications, uncompounded luminosity. I found a nectar-like Dharma. But since no one will understand what I'm going to say, I will stay silently in the forest. Those were the words of the Buddha in the beginning. He had this insight, he became enlightened, but the time wasn't ripe yet for the Buddha to teach it. He would have been misunderstood. So for 49 days, the story goes that the Buddha remained silently in the forest until he was requested to teach. It said that celestial beings, realizing, understanding his attainment, basically appeared before him and said, please teach. And then he walked to Varanasi, where he met his previous ascetic disciples, Asvati and so forth, the 5 disciples, and gave the first teaching. He started to turn the wheel of Dharma, the wheel of the Four Noble Truths, as it's called. So the first wheel is also called the wheel of the Four Noble Truths. But His Holiness has a unique way to explain this quote from the Lalita Vistara Sutra. He says, profound and pacified refers to the first wheel. It's profound and pacified. So profound and peace, you could also translate it as profound and peace. It's the profound teachings on the Four Noble Truths, which teaches the path to peace, to liberation. That is the first wheel. And then he goes on to say, free from fabrications. So the fabrications of holding on to an unrealistic mode of existence. Fabrications, those are something, that's the word that is used in English at least, it's a translation from a Tibetan term, that is used a lot to refer to our extreme misperception of fabricating this world, fabricating as like our mind, fabricating this concrete, independent kind of objective world out there. So that's called a fabrication. It's a misperception, basically. A mind that's just mistaken, that is wrong. So free from fabrications indicates the second Dharma wheel. Free from fabrications, it teaches emptiness, and therefore it teaches the way to train our mind in such a way that we attain wisdom that is free from these wrong views, free from these fabrications. And then lastly, uncompounded luminosity. And that refers to the last wheel. So luminosity, uncompounded here in the sense of like lasting clarity, which is the clarity of our mind. Luminosity can also be translated as clear light. Our mind is sometimes described as being clear, as being like clear light. The subtlest mind we all have, and that is the mind that is actually the one that transforms into the mind of a Buddha, is in fact described as the clear light mind. In that when it arises, there's this clarity. There's the clarity with respect to, well, taking to mind emptiness, for instance. A very clear perception of emptiness takes place. But I think it's more about the sense of this clarity arising together with that mind. I mean, I have a hard time to really explain it. But it also has the connotation of the mind being from its actual nature, it's clear and knowing. Clear, again, means that anything can appear to the mind. So the word clear in English doesn't connote the same as it does in Tibetan. Clear in the sense like a clear mirror, an unblemished mirror in which everything can appear. So our mind is like a mirror. Actually, we can think of anything and it appears. right? But right now it is obstructed. It is obstructed, so therefore things don't appear as clearly as they potentially could. And secondly, of course, we don't give thought to everything. I mean, there's no way. We're too preoccupied with ourselves and with our own worries and so forth. But our mind has the ability for anything to appear to it, and whatever appears, we have the ability to know it. So that's the actual nature of the mind. And the clear light mind, the very subtle mind, is actually not affected by all our obstructions, all our afflictions. Not at all. It's not afflicted. It's not affected at all. But we cannot hold on to it. It's only when we die, it manifests at the moment of death, or just before death. So just before our consciousness leaves our body, this very subtle mind manifests. And there are a few other times when we faint, at the time of deep sleep, when we sneeze, right? It's very interesting. At the time of orgasm, it briefly manifests, but it's not the actual clear light mind, that subtlest mind, the actual full mind, if you like, arises at the time of death. And the other occasions, they're just similitudes. They're just similar states. They're not exactly the same as that clear light mind. It's a very interesting mind, incredibly interesting. And we have the chance to talk more about it. That is not affected by the afflictions. Anyway, but right now we cannot access it, we cannot manifest it, but it's good to know that this is the actual nature of our mind. And so when this verse from the Lalita Vistara Sutra, when it says uncompounded luminosity or uncompounded clear light, it's indicating the third turning in the wheel in which the Buddha set forth the mind that realizes emptiness, the mind that is the Buddha nature, is that which transforms to eventually become the mind of a Buddha. Remember, I talked about it this morning as part of the third wheel. So it's that clear nature of the mind that doesn't get lost, uncompounded in the sense, doesn't get lost, it's always there, it doesn't change. That nature of our mind cannot be taken from us. Okay. Anyway, so with the sutra, what we hear is the Buddha will give these three turnings of the wheel, but right now he's saying, not yet. I still keep quiet in the forest until the time is ripe. And then, of course, he set forth teachings, the Four Noble Truth teachings. And it's just this wheel, it's not just one teaching, it's a whole collection of different teachings the Buddha gave at that time to teach the Four Noble Truth and to teach mainly on the path or on the methods to becoming liberated. And then with the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, he taught the methods, the means to become enlightened, but of course also very specifically emptiness of all phenomena. And lastly, he taught, during the third turning of the wheel, he specified some doubts. There's one sutra that specifically was specifically meant to specify some doubts people had, but there's also the sutra on Buddha nature that teaches the actual nature of our mind and so forth, and of course the tantric teachings. Okay, I said all this morning, but let's start to briefly mention it again. So then if we return to the sutra, having finished the title, then there's one more line, which is the homage by the translators. So homage to the perfection of wisdom, the Bhagavati, it says. As you've heard before, the translators who translated this text from Sanskrit to Tibetan, they first added the title, the Sanskrit first, to show the authenticity of the text, then the Tibetan title, then the length of the text by way of the words one segment or one section, and then it says homage to the perfection of wisdom, the Bhagavati. So up to here, usually when the text is recited, this part is actually not recited. It's part of the actual text, but it really starts with, thus have I heard at one time. But the homage, this is something that was customary in Tibet, that it was seen as, well, it served many purposes, a few different purposes. So one was for the translators to complete their translation. because if you've ever translated something, it's a lot of work. It takes much longer than you ever expect, right? I mean, any translation work, I sometimes have to translate text, and it always takes longer than I expect, because then I have to go over it again and check this word, and is this better? And sometimes just the word to find the right term in a particular language is just really difficult. So the translators at that time, I mean, nowadays we have iPads with very good dictionaries. You just type it in and you've got the meaning of the word. You've got online dictionaries. There's so much available. At the time of these translators, I mean, these translators were incredible. Their sacrifice, in the sense that they actually went from Tibet. I mean, they had to travel from Tibet in the 8th century, around the 7th, 8th century. Some say Buddhism started to come into Tibet in the 6th century. There was a particular king. So at that time there was already a text, or some texts came to Tibet, but no one really understood them. So, but anyway, that's just mentioned kind of at the side. But mainly during the time of a king called Songtsen Gampo in the 7th, 8th century. So at that time, Buddhism actually was brought to Tibet. And he had 2 wives, a wife from China, a wife from Nepal. And these 2 wives basically introduced to him Buddhism, because in China Buddhism was already existent. In Nepal it was existent before as well. I mean, it was part of, just as in India it was existent, it was also existent in Nepal. I don't think it was called India or Nepal at that time. The borders were very different, but what is nowadays Nepal. So anyway, they introduced the Dharma to the king, and the king started to send translators to India. Now, this was a huge culture shock, because those were people born and bred in Tibet, on the high altitude. They didn't have diseases. They didn't even have to brush their teeth, because they didn't have the bacteria, what have you, that you have on the plains of India, right? It being much warmer, a different climate, different food. And the story goes that most of them passed away. They didn't make it. First, the journey was really troublesome. I mean, the journey was really hard, with a lot of, people robbing them on the way, possibly killing them. Of course, they needed some food and possibly some I don't know, money or precious jewels, etc. So to be able to survive in India, and they were robbed and sometimes killed. Many of them died possibly of the common cold, because they had no protection from that from Tibet. I don't know. It's not detailed, but the story goes that so many died. So many died on the road. So many died as they arrived in India and got sick. And then, of course, masters also went from Tibet, from India to Tibet, and also many of them passed away. So translators possibly, but also great masters, and not all of them survived. So it was great hardship. And then they didn't have dictionaries, and they didn't have all the means and the tools we have nowadays. I don't know, they probably had some papers, some, what is it called, parched kind of papers, like these paper rolls, but it was hard to use them, and it definitely wasn't easy to write anything down, and if you made a mistake, oh no, something. Anyway, so the hardship, what they underwent is unbelievable, and they were so thorough. They would always be in groups. They were not alone. Usually just one translator is mentioned, but oftentimes it was more than one translator getting together with the Sanskrit masters and working very closely with them. I mean, Sanskrit masters means Buddhist masters who had an incredible knowledge of the Sanskrit language, but of the Dharma as well. And then step by step, they translated these texts. Incredible. That's all they did. So this is also an opportunity to be grateful. I mean, for us, it's also like, remember the translators. This is the homage by the translators. The incredible hardship and sacrifice they underwent, the sacrifices they made in order to be able to make the Dharma available to us, which of course later on in India was no longer available. So the Tibetans basically preserved it in Tibet. And so now, of course, we still have some Sanskrit texts, but it didn't survive as a living tradition with monasteries and so forth. Those were slowly destroyed, and that was the end of Buddhism. Anyway, so to remember their kindness. And for the translators to successfully complete their work. As I said, it's a lot of work. With modern tools, even then, it's hard, it takes time, but even harder at that time, with all the facilities, lacking all the facilities. Okay, so therefore, it is seen as, for them, like to pay homage, to make that connection with Buddha's bodhisattvas, well, in this case, the Bhagavati, the female Buddha, the blessed, the female Buddha of compassion, as she's also called. So the Blessed Mother here refers on one hand to wisdom itself, to wisdom, the perfection of wisdom sutras, and to wisdom, but also there's this Buddha figure, like Prajnaparamita, the female Buddha of wisdom. We know of Manjushri, the male Buddha of wisdom, and then there's also Prajnaparamita. This is more tantric, actually, but it kind of comes into the non-tantric aspect of Buddhism. So Prajnaparamita, it's really hard to think of these, what are called oftentimes deities, but they're really just another way of saying they're the qualities, all the qualities of the Buddhas, the quality of compassion, all the compassion of all the Buddhas that have come, that are to come, that will come in the future, they are depicted in the form of Avalokiteshvara, right? Avalokiteshvara, the Buddha of compassion. So just for us to connect, it's just a means for us to connect to this incredible compassion. Because how can we visualize compassion? This compassion of all the Buddhas. So it helps us to visualize it in the form of a living being. Okay, in the form of a Buddha figure. And it is said that a Buddha can actually manifest as such a Buddha of compassion, because a Buddha is not limited to one body as we are. But this is a whole different, more complicated part of Buddhism that goes into the kind of mystical and so forth. The more it makes sense that our mind has this incredible ability to manifest in different ways. So right now we can only manifest with one body. But an enlightened being can manifest in all different ways as it's most suitable to those they're teaching. And so one form is the Buddha of compassion, or the Buddha of wisdom, the female aspect. So they're both symbolic, but also Buddhas can manifest in those forms. Okay, saying that much, that's enough on all that mystical stuff, but let's go back to what is easier to comprehend. Well, the fact that here it's the wisdom really that, not just the Buddha of wisdom, but really wisdom that the translators pay homage to complete this work, but also to inspire us. That's another purpose, to inspire us, right? When you hear this, oh, pay homage. You remember I talked about these conducive states of mind that are conducive for learning this material. Compassion is one, but also the sense of devotion and gratitude. It opens our mind. Okay? So when you meet a great being and you feel like, wow, how wonderful. There's joy in our mind, but also, I want to become like that. Right? That is also part of devotion. I spoke about it yesterday when I said there are different types of devotion. There's this joyful devotion, feeling inspired. But then there's also the aspirational devotion, where based on encountering a being whose actions are very inspirational, you then go, I want to be like that. Right? And so that opens your mind to something greater. Because, I mean, unless we have the wish to become like these great beings, we're not going to take the steps towards it. That's the first step. The first step of any spiritual practice, because no one can force us. So we need to have the wish, we need to have the aspiration to become like that. Okay? So therefore, devotion, first of all, psychologically, it's a very healthy state of mind. And it's a good basis based on which we open ourselves to new ideas and take the first step towards change. Okay? Change that brings us more peace and more mental happiness. Okay, so therefore it's also considered to be inspirational just to read this. Oh, there's some devotional aspect. Okay. Anyway, having said all this, now the actual sutra starts. This doesn't say that in your text, but well, I left a line. So now the sutra starts, and the sutra can be subdivided into a prologue and the actual sutra. A prologue and an actual sutra. Some people would also say there's a conclusion. There's divided. Again, there's different ways in which you kind of structure the text around outlines. So you've got the prologue, the actual sutra, and a conclusion, when everyone is happy at the very end. You've probably read the sutra, which we will do tomorrow as well. In the beginning, we can actually add the Heart Sutra and read it together. Okay, so the prologue. One thing to mention at this point, this particular version of the Heart Sutra, as you've probably heard, this sutra is widely recited in many different Buddhist countries. In China, in Korea, and in Japan. So Buddhism actually, before it went to Tibet, it went to China. And from China, it went to Japan, and it went to Korea and Vietnam. Vietnam, China, yes. And here I'm talking about mainly the universal vehicle teaching, so the Nalanda tradition. It went to China. Of course, the Pali tradition, or the fundamental vehicle tradition, that had spread very early on to Sri Lanka, to Thailand, to Burma, and so forth. The countries that we usually describe as Theravada countries. Nowadays, the word Theravada, or the system of the elders, as Theravada can be translated as. So this system went to many countries early on very quickly because it was the mainstream teaching. And then later on, as the universal vehicle teachings became more part of the mainstream, they traveled to China, as I just said, and then around the 7th, 8th century to Tibet, and from Tibet to Mongolia, to the Himalayan regions, which were actually originally part of Tibet. I mean, Ladakh and Zanskar, for instance, they were part of the Tibetan plateau, but later on it became part of India, and nowadays are described as the Himalaya regions. And then, of course, Russia, parts of Russia. There are quite a few areas